Okay, so hello again. So we're very pleased to have you this afternoon for the second part of our symposium. And so we'll be having several papers, as you saw on the program. For our keynote, we are very honored to have Joan Allen as our keynote speaker. Joan Allen is a renowned specialist on Chartist studies. She's held different senior positions in the Chartist Association, or the Chartist Studies Association, and she will be giving a most certainly fascinating paper on Chartism and Chartist periodicals. Thank you very much, Joan, for coming and responding to this invitation.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a wonderful thing to be here and to present a paper to you all, especially as I've listened to so very many fine papers already this morning, so no pressure, I fear. Nope.
Let's see if we can edit that.
It's gone. Oh.
Isn't it working? Oh, because we need this story, perhaps that may be useful.
Okay. It's not going ahead.
Oh, yes, you can go back to the beginning.
Here's the slideshow.
Yeah, this one.
Yes, there we are. Okay, so we can go to the first slide. Okay, and then I'll just check that it works well. It's on the screen
every time we change the format. So perhaps we'll keep it in that format then. Save it, and then normally should be able to.
So I can just use that. Okay, apologies. Okay, so there has been a large literature on the British periodical press more generally, and certainly in terms of the Chartist press, which I've added to myself alongside other colleagues and friends in Chartist studies, particularly Alan Jones and of course Owen Ashton. But in this paper, I want to contend that it's the proliferation of a dynamic propagandist Chartist press that was of primary importance to the emergence and resilience of the British Chartist movement between 1837 and 1858. It was not just the Northern Star, but countless other provincial Chartist titles, such as the Northern Liberator, the True Scotsman, and the Western Vindicator, for example, which transformed the myriad of disparate radical campaigns into a unified working class movement for democracy and electoral reform. Of course, many radical journals such as Black Dwarf or Cobbett's Political Register or the Poor Man's Guardian were published in the early decades of the 19th century, but their readership was almost entirely middle class, restricted to those who could afford the cover price when the cost of additional taxation made it punitively so much more expensive. In radical circles, this was nothing less than the taxation on knowledge, and removing the tax became a central aim of reformers. Whereas previous expressions of radical dissent had been typified by their essentially local character and impromptu gatherings, the Chartist press promoted collective action and unity of purpose. At its high point, some 123 titles were in print, but this figure is much greater if we take account of those titles which were sympathetic to the aims of Chartism, though not officially recognised as Chartist newspapers. And these, of course, this 123 are only those which have survived. So we truly do not know how many titles were actually in print. Harnessing all the benefits of industrial innovation, not least more sophisticated print technology and distribution systems, and freed from most of the punitive taxes that had priced newspapers out of the hands of working people, Chartism flourished. Chartist newspapers broke new ground in offering a rigorous analysis of the inequities of British society and presented a persuasive six-point agenda, that which we came to know as the Charter for Political Change, which focused on the shared experience of the exploited, impoverished, and unrepresented classes. Its campaigning journalism encouraged women to participate too, as readers, contributors, fundraisers, poets, members, and activists. The Chartist press and the movement's leadership were intent on progressing ideas about social justice, liberty, and equality, ideals that breached national and international boundaries and underpinned close working relationships with reformers and Republicans in America and across Europe. So if we turn to the economic roots of early protest movements, I would suggest that these were, or tended to be, localized trade disputes, local grievances, based in rural communities and early industrialization, and in that sense, separated from urban areas, which were typified by squalor and incoming workers and lots of disease. Mechanization and loss of independence, unemployment, and most importantly, underemployment, which did not provide a living wage, de-skilling, and the loss of status. These were all causes that directed people into the demand for change. And of course, we have these early protest strategies. We've heard this morning already about food riots, which figured large numbers of women because they were in charge of providing food, and they frequently took charge of food rioting. Small-scale public demonstrations. Now, by small scale, I don't mean that some of these demonstrations were very small, only that they do not compete at all with the kind of demonstrations or the scale of demonstrations we have when we get into the Chartist years. They assumed very constitutional positions, so they wrote letters to their MPs as small groups and associations. They gathered petitions to Parliament. They posted bills in public places complaining of what they were objecting to and outlining their demands. There were radical journals. I've mentioned some of them already. And then, of course, most interestingly, I think, threatening letters, which takes us into, for example, Luddism. So the Luddites were very good, I think, posting bills and suggesting an ultimatum. So this one here, we have a declaration by Thomas Death to Edward Ludd in Nottingham, home of the lace trade, which was particularly in difficulties, partly because the importation of cheaper lace, but also because lace making was highly skilled. And those who were losing their employment, they resented the loss of skill and the loss of wages. So it was both of those things together. And here we have the declaration from a public place, declaration extraordinary, justice, death, or revenge. Those three quite stark choices, addressed to our well-beloved brother and Captain-in-Chief, Edward Ludd. And this is the rest of the poster, somewhat trimmed, whereas it had been represented to us, the general agitators for the northern counties, that Charles Lacey of the town of Nottingham, British lace manufacturer, has been guilty of divers fraudulent and oppressive acts, whereby he has reduced to poverty and misery 700 of our beloved brethren. And it's almost a kind of religious gesture there, the beloved brethren, whereby he has ruined the cotton lace trade. Now, when we get into the Chartist years, we do have some very, very interesting newspapers. And what I want to suggest to you is that there is a sophistication here that we don't find in the earlier period. Not that the Black Dwarf or Cobbett's Register were not highly intellectual journals, they were, but it's the way that they managed the mass circulation of newspapers that matters most. I'm talking to you about the Northern Liberator today and trying to focus on it because it's the first Chartist newspaper, not the Northern Star. It is actually in print some 3 weeks earlier, so October 1837, and is also one of the longer lived newspapers, so it has a 3-year run. And there you can see the front page, and you'll note the Gothic typeface, which has a kind of biblical register. Any use of Gothic is suggesting something important. And the title is quite deliberate. It's not going to be a review or a circular. It's a liberator. So it tends to be active. It is going to intervene in the movement. So to tell you something about the Northern Liberator, well, it's a stamped weekly paper. So they are paying the 4p tax to the state. It's able to circulate 4,000 copies by the 20th of January. Now, that's only 6 weeks into production. It's a very, very rapid climbing of the circulation rates, which tells us something about the amount of energy and dynamism that's being invested in this paper. It's circulating the northern counties, published in Newcastle, but circulating certainly across the northeast, but down into what you might describe as northern industrial areas. It had a circulation of 112 British towns. It employed a London reporter to report on Parliament's doings, and that was quite an innovative thing. It published 2 editions per week, one on Friday evening, so that where the paper was travelling to further flung places, both all of the readership could read it at the same time, so that it wasn't the case that the Newcastle readers were getting the paper first and everyone else was getting yesterday's news. The aim was to reach everybody at once. And of course, they took to satirical content to evade the censors, whose eyes were always on circulation papers. Now, we know that a lot of working people were not literate or were semi-literate at this time. And Robert Blakey and Thomas Doubleday, who were the editors, were determined to reach that wider working class readership. And so they quite often resorted to visual content so they could graphically illustrate the points they were trying to make. I'm sure you'll recognize this tree of taxation, as they called it, because it had been used throughout the ages. It has a biblical root almost, but then had been used by subsequent radicals. And it's meant to just illustrate the way that the benefits of society are only reaching that top layer of society. Very, very little of the benefits is reaching to the bottom, where you see the working people depicted. Now, quite cleverly, what they did with this visual content, apart from producing it in the newspapers themselves, they produced them as handbills, so that they could circulate these to branches of the National Charter Association and, of course, the local branch of the Northern Political Union. The idea being that they could sell them to these branches, and then that would then circulate more widely. Like many papers at the time, they produced serialized content, serialized stories. In this case, again, satire. And they circulate these in Britain and New York separately, so that they could be sold as Christmas volumes. So, for example, the Political Pilgrim's Progress makes play of Bunyan's famous story, and The Tale of a Tub too. And these were both commercially very successful, but also they were truly propagandizing via this novel means. In 1839, they had home deliveries. So I think you can begin to see just how innovative this newspaper and its editors were. Poetry, of course, was being published from the very first issue, and typically with the tune, so that those who didn't know the tune would recognize it from hymn books like the Old Hundred. And if you're interested in this idea of poetry and hymn making and using songs and tunes together, then you should look at the work of Mike Sanders, who has published a good deal on this question. Needless to say, the Northern Liberator, with its determination to intervene, was an advocate of physical force Chartism. And fairly quickly, they began to carry a small header on the front page, quoting from Blackstone, who was the authority on the ancient right to bear arms. And you can't get anything more forceful than saying, dear reader, legally, you're entitled to do it. They offered advice on how to make cartridges and grenades. They published inflammatory speeches without editing out the quite significant encouragement to violence. And they coordinated mass demonstrations. For example, on Coronation Day, when everyone was celebrating the Queen's coronation, 80,000 people gathered on the town moor, which was common land. And that's a significant number of people, I think you'll agree, but they wouldn't have managed this kind of mass demonstration without the Northern Liberator giving detailed information, both about how to process from the transportation point through the city up to the common ground, and in what order of precedence this should take, and who would speak and where they would speak on this enormous piece of open ground, so that those intending to attend had very good instructions about how to carry on their campaigning, if you like. So in a very powerful way, you could say that the Northern Liberator, and of course the Northern Star and other papers that were being published, were providing leadership. They were not just reporting events. This is not simply reportage. I've briefly put up this slide on the Western Vindicator. The Western Vindicator is very cleverly being published on the English border with Wales, but also circulating in South Wales too. And that's quite unusual, I would argue, an attempt to bridge these two nations. And you have to remember that many people in Wales at this point in time are Welsh speakers. But there is still a determination, particularly by Henry Vincent, who is the editor at this time. And he is reporting quite bluntly about the Newport Rising, which had taken place only a few days before, with this headline, "Revolution in Wales." Not for him to pull his punches about whether this rising was a revolution or not. He states quite frankly that that's what he believes it to be, or the start of. Now we can play with those questions, but perhaps not today. Now, of course, we have to talk about the Northern Star. The Northern Star is circulating longer than any of these other papers. It's in print, as I said, from December 1837 through to 1852. It's a paper which is, to all intents and purposes, providing national leadership and is recognised as such. But the sharp-eyed among you will notice that it's the Northern Star and Leeds General Advertiser. So it is also operating as a town newspaper. It's serving the Leeds area, and it's providing all of the content that locals would expect to find in their own local paper. So it is juggling both its political dynamic as well as its commercial necessity. But most interestingly, at this point in time, when many newspapers, if not, well, maybe 90% of them, would have their commercial advertising on the front page, O'Connor, who owns the paper, is determined that this will present itself as a political paper, and therefore, most unusually, it doesn't carry its advertisements on the front page. Here what we have is an announcement about the Henry Hunt Memorial with a rather beautiful graphic illustration of its unveiling. So the Northern Star and Leeds General Advertiser, published in Leeds itself. This is where its print works are situated. It's circulating throughout Britain, and an estimated, now this is a kind of round figure, so you know it can't be completely accurate, but a lot of this is based on stamp duty, so there is a financial trail you can follow if you want to work out how many papers are being circulated. So they have a claimed circulation rate of 80,000 copies per week. It also runs to 8 editions and has to if it's going to circulate throughout the British Isles itself. Its owner, as I said, is Fergus O'Connor. So this gives a good deal more gravitas to this claim to be the national paper, because Fergus, of course, is recognised as the national leader. And although it has a series of editors, the one I want to draw attention to is George Julian Harney. And I'll come back to Harney later. The Northern Star has been really looked at carefully by almost all historians of the movement to one extent or the other. They have looked at the letters page, and the argument is that this bridged the gender as well as the class divide. They received so many poetic offerings that they simply couldn't print them all. There was just far too many. And there were some complaints that the poetry wasn't very good either. But certainly it became known for printing poetry. And the fact that Chartist readers were taking to poetry to express how they felt, well, historians of emotions would make something of that, I think, now, more than even in the past. They coordinated funds, and as with the Northern Liberator, there was a good deal of coordinating of events. Petitions had to be, certainly what we call the Great Petitions, 1839, 1842, 1848. These were monster petitions and could not be gathered in the usual way, but had to be managed, if you like, through the pages of the paper. The land plan, which some have argued in the past that the land plan derailed Chartists' political intent into simply finding a way of acquiring their voting rights through financial means. But we, I think, have a more nuanced understanding of the land plan now. And certainly, again, the land plan and its subscription base had to be coordinated somehow. And the pages of the Northern Star is the obvious place to go. And then, of course, the National Charter Association membership, when that is launched, the paper is invaluable. Here we've got a copy of a membership card. And I think it's worth pausing just to look at it, really. So it proclaims that it is the National Charter Association of Great Britain. You've got the 6 points in that circular emblem in the middle, topped with a cap of liberty. And then on one side, a hive, gesturing to Thomas Spence and his hive of liberty. And on the other, a sheaf of wheat, because there is a strong and powerful belief of the importance of land and land ownership to the cause of democracy. And then you'll see the symbolism below. We have a thistle, we have a rose, and we have a shamrock. Now you might say, well, where is the daffodil for Wales, or the leek even? Well, of course, these tropes were not really considered very seriously at this point. But also there was a tendency then and even now to bolt England and Wales together as if it is one simple country. Well, we won't go there, not with a Welsh husband in the room. Now, these papers and all their efforts to promote the Charter and Chartism. The Northern Star, as I said, shared its editor, George Julian Harney, with this journal, which I've put up on the board for you on this PowerPoint slide. This, I think, is a more interesting development in the Chartist press in the period that we are looking at. So the Democratic Review of British and Foreign Politics, History and Literature. It's not a very combative title, I think you'll agree. It's a review. It's surveying the fields of politics, history and literature, rather than suggesting an intervention. But if you were to dip into the pages of this fairly small scale journal, what you would find is that lots of the contributors are European. That you are going to find people like Louis Blanc or Kossuth or Mazzini or W.J. Linton, who was often seen as the voice of European republicanism. They are some of the people who are writing in this journal. So George Julian Harney, who is absolutely committed to the European cause and believes that British Chartism and the European cause must be brought together by this point. I mean, after all, this is post-Kennington Common. Most of the British titles I've talked about are no longer in print, though, of course, the Northern Star continues to circulate. Nothing like at the rate that it did before, of course. That wasn't possible by this stage, but it's nevertheless still the voice of Chartism. It has also moved to London by this point too. So it's operating as a sort of London journal, but still, as I say, presenting itself as the primary vehicle of British Chartism. George Julian Harney, who represented Newcastle in 1838-39 and had close ties to the Northern Liberator, who edited the journal in Leeds and then moves to London. He ends up editing both the Northern Star and the Democratic Review at the same time. And he and Fergus fall out with each other. Fergus does not want the Northern Star to be a vehicle for European politics. Harney, however, is completely determined and is more than willing to put his own money into the venture. Now, we've had someone this morning mentioned the Fraternal Democrats, which was launched in 1845. But what Harney attempts with his new journal is to relaunch this association. And if you look closely at the slide, you'll see that this too is a membership card. And you have this membership card with its slogan, "All men are brethren," is actually captured in 12 different languages, 12 different European languages. So this tells you something about the ambition to bring all of these groups together on what he calls the great principle of fraternity. All men are brethren, as he insists. And you have that central motif: equality, liberty, fraternity. The Review is not the only journal that Harney is publishing at this point. He has the Northern Star, he has the Democratic Review, which is a fairly heavyweight volume of reviewing both British politics, domestic and foreign, and also the cause of European republicanism abroad. But he is not satisfied by this. He is, as I say, an extreme radical, or possibly you might want to call him an ultra radical. And so he launches his Red Republican. Now, obviously, this is a fairly high risk and inflammatory activity, with its header, its cap of liberty, and its the idea of the Red Republican. It's very, very suggestive, I would say. Harney's Red Republican becomes the repository of the manifesto of the German Communist Party, and the first English translation of the Communist Manifesto appears in the Red Republican itself. And I think that is highly significant. It had, of course, already circulated in London and throughout Britain in its German form. But this idea that they would make it available and accessible to English readers is a very dramatic step forward. And most interestingly, I think, it is translated by a woman, the rather mysterious Scottish translator, Helen Macfarlane. Helen Macfarlane, we know something about through David Black's biography, but it's also, there's some sketchiness around the period after she does this translation work. But we know that what we do know for sure is she's a close friend of Marx and Engels, and they trust her to write her own translation. And when we had the Chartism Day in Reading in September, we had a very, very interesting paper looking at the translation itself and how much latitude she had in producing this translation, which scholars in Britain and indeed in other places have picked over and relied upon for its absolute veracity. But we have to give her some credit for interpreting this manifesto in ways that she chose, however slight or subtle those changes were. She was also contributing to the Democratic Review. Harney had absolute confidence in her abilities to be this translator and to carry this very, very important work. And initially she does write under a pseudonym, and perfectly understandably, because at the time credibility for women did rest upon whether you could be accepted or taken seriously, or whether anyone would think that this document was legitimate if it was translated by someone who signed herself off, Helen Macfarlane. So I think there is still a lot of work to be done on Helen Macfarlane, and I think she should be adopted by some of us as an extraordinarily interesting woman who gives us an insight into where women are by the end of this Chartist period, by 1850, that they are very active, subscribing to the land plan. They don't always subscribe in their own names, but nevertheless, we know that women are very, very involved in the land plan itself. And of course, they're involved in family finance. So if the family are investing in the land plan, so are they, to all intents and purposes. So I want to try to bring some of these ideas to a close and find the script. So, some conclusions and a suggestion, perhaps. So, I've tried to put the case for the importance of the Chartist press in galvanising activists and reformers across the length and breadth of the British Isles. Its success rested largely on the sheer ambition of press owners who risked their own capital, who harnessed new technology. So this, is using steam. It's producing papers far more rapidly and adopting circulation plans and rates and distribution systems and all kinds of novel features in a bid to produce a print culture that I think looks truly modern even now. It seems somewhat ironic, I would suggest to you, that the massive industrial change and technological innovation, which we are told robbed skilled workers of their livelihoods and independent status, and rendered thousands impoverished, unemployed and destitute, should actually be the means by which the case for democracy was so effectively propagandized and embraced. So where does this take us to in terms of the historiography that says this was a knife and fork, bread and cheese question? It's more complex than I think we realise. I have deliberately shifted the focus away from the Northern Star, not because I want to downplay its significance, but because I want to stress the importance of the proliferation of the Chartist press and how we need to somehow capture so much more of it. Now, this does not mean by using OCR and digital papers to simply word search, because if we are going to arrive at a better understanding of the Chartist press, I think we are going to have to look at these papers fully, properly, look at running issues of it, seeing the shifts and turns in both its staffing and its production methods and its messaging over time. Different titles served their own locale and regions first. The personal was the local. So what we have with these papers are local papers, and we must see that as important too. How did they serve that local environment? Because this is where our working class membership is going to come from. They were the readers at the local level. So even though papers like the Liberator or the Vindicator successfully breached their immediate geographical boundaries, they had the ambition to be bigger papers than they were and to reach other readership. Nevertheless, it's a balancing act between local readership and pushing further afield. I've also tried to suggest the way that smaller circulating journals in the late Chartist period, such as the Democratic Review and the Red Republican, played a vital role in raising the tenor of international discourse. As John Saville noted, this channel of communication was, he said, quote, of inestimable value, both at the time and for the movements of the future. So in other words, building these fraternities, these bonds of association between Europeans and British Chartists was going to remain on whatever scale, whether that was small scale or large scale. It was going to feed into those movements which followed on from this period. I think I will leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Many thanks, Joan, for this very enlightening presentation. Very covering all sorts of wonderful topics that we've been broaching. It's true in different ways since the beginning of the symposium. But I think you raised lots of very interesting questions. So perhaps I would have one question to ask. There's another one if there's time, but about that particular time where you talked about Julius Harney and his editorship of the Northern Star, and at the same time his editorship of the Red Republican, yes, and that third also publication. And that's right. And so I mean, what should we make of that? The coexistence of those different functions he had, or different roles? Were they competing, or at least were they? At one time, did they seem compatible for him, and then were they just the beginning of the split or the ideological division that occurred lter on?
I think it's both. I think they give us great insights into the gap that's beginning to open up between Harney and his ambitions for a more European Chartist period. And what Fergus O'Connor wants to do is to hold fast to democratic and indeed domestic politics. So he wants he wants the Northern Star to report on trade disputes, and in particular on the success of the land plan. And he doesn't really feel the same necessity to bring in European content. Now, some of that is defensive, clearly. He is worried about the commercial viability of the paper. He's the owner, and he's naturally risk averse, you could argue. And we know that Fergus has avoided putting himself into the front line several occasions. So the paper is indeed a money spinner. It's also his paper. So it's so closely identified with him that he doesn't really want it to be associated as Harney's paper. And he wants the public to read the paper and understand his political position. And so it's a very tricky situation for them both to negotiate. And I think this is why Harney puts his own money into the Democratic Review and the Red Republican, because I think it's partly he sees it as an exit clause, a way for him to remove himself from the Northern Star if and when it becomes necessary. But also his commitment to the European cause is absolute, you could say. And it only becomes more, he only becomes more committed as he heads into the pages of the Red Republican. But I think you can't read these three papers in isolation in this period, because you have to realise that if you have a single editor editing three papers, that is telling you something more. Just as we would notice now if we were reading a modern newspaper and we knew under whose ownership several titles were being published, we would make something of that. Does that answer your question?
And perhaps the underlying question behind that was also about, well, newspapers as a means both to propagate Chartist ideas, but you were also saying, seem to be suggesting that I had the impression that sometimes newspapers could also not only serve the cause but serve to polarize certain movements, and instead of perhaps just voicing the different views of different groups, you could see it from another perspective, which would be that they would just entrench people in such and such a group or such and such a locality, which would in fact so perhaps not really serve the Chartist cause, that will Chartism, and it will perhaps highlight the fact that Chartism was multifaceted.
Yes, that's right. Certainly the Northern Star wanted a single message and worked very hard to present that single message to which everyone might subscribe. But that's not what you find when you look at other papers. So if you look at, say, the True Scotsman, for example, we know that religion was more important across the border into Scotland, and they held fast to quite strong ideas about temperance and about the moral rectitude of Chartists and how they might behave. I mean, there is a bid to present Chartists as respectable applicants for the vote. And so, that inflection of religion and temperance associations, I think tells us that there are different types of Chartism, and you can often capture this through those very, very particular newspapers.
Other questions, other responses or remarks? Yes, Miriam.
You mentioned that the Northern Liberator organized home delegates. Could you say more about that? What was that for? What did they want to achieve through that?
Well, they were aware that they wanted to reach areas where there may not have been a place where a copy could be purchased. And so they realized there was another readership, a wider readership that could be captured by delivering. Now, sometimes that was a delivery to a place of work. So it might be to a colliery, or it might be to a factory, for example. And then from there, those individuals would deliver them to their own local area. So it's quite a clever idea, quite cost effective, because they would bulk deliver and then someone would take on the charge, probably, I would guess, freely, as members of a local Chartist association, to take it upon themselves to supply those papers and gather the necessary price of the paper from whoever they delivered it to.
Other questions? We're appealing to our students, who I'm sure have had lots of things that may that they could respond to. Perhaps you need a bit of time to digest that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, I was wondering about all the labor that goes into the production of all of the tests, and trying to think about what's given. So there's an entrepreneurial side to all of these ventures. So
Yes.
we need to make money, or we need to at least sort of break even so that that's continue going without the owner
Certainly.
needing money. So there are commercial strategies that are put together for this, which you've shown quite well. But I'm wondering how much we know about the people working for these papers, specifically not just writers, but also the printers, but also just let's say the history from below of the British Chartist Press.
We know a little, certainly, about some of them. So the more well-known and longer-lived papers, you can get at some of that information. So we know about the Northern Liberators compositing team because they complain bitterly that their working conditions are very poor and they are not being paid enough. And so it becomes a sort of little dispute, not a little dispute, but a dispute indoors, which causes some problems, it has to be said. And they hire an Irish journalist, Thomas Enderby, who later writes the odd book of the 19th century. It's worth getting hold of, actually. It's very odd, but quite insightful. And he does write about the time he spent working on the Northern Liberator before he goes off to New York. And so we know a bit about how much the staff were involved in the local Northern Political Union. We know how much they were involved in helping local groups to make pikes and grenades and other incendiary devices. So we can get at some of it, but it's piecemeal. So I don't know that you'd be able to write about compositors generally, in some of these papers, but they tended to be committed. It's not just a job. In other words, they are working on these papers because they believe in what the paper is trying to achieve. Does that help? I should probably say that you remember I mentioned the proclamation about Blackstone and having the right to bear arms and being determined to put it into every single issue of the paper. Of course, the paper does eventually fall foul of the seditious legislation, and the lead editor, Robert Blakey, is taken to court, and he is bound over to keep the peace to the tune of £500, which is more than his stake in the paper itself. And so he has to, then the paper folds, and he goes off to Queen's Belfast, where he gets a chair in logic and has a very, very fine academic career. And at the end of it, he gets the Queen's purse, which it seems so sweet, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions or replies?
And do write to me if you think I can answer a question you don't feel able to ask today. Thank you.
Chartist women,
Yes.
did they have access to the papers like everybody else, or did Chartist papers organize so that women local groups could also have access to publication and orders of meeting orders and that sort of thing?
I think certainly in the late 1830s, early 1840s, it's more tricky, because we know that in papers like the Northern Star and the Northern Liberator are being read in public houses. So for those who couldn't read it for themselves, there would be someone who would read it, and the paper was then what we call hear read. So it reached a much bigger audience than the actual circulation rate. But often this was happening again in workplaces where you might not find women. Some areas you might. So in Lancashire and Yorkshire, where you're more likely to have textiles, for example, and you're more likely to have a female workforce, they would be the places where they might access the Northern Star or a local northern industrial Chartist newspaper.
I found evidence of women associated with the Northern Star in an article in the Northern Star about the papers moved from Leeds to London. They threw like a big party that started with the tea, which was served by ladies with mixed sociability of women and men. And then, if I remember well, the article says, and then the intellectual part of the evening began, and then they went to a tavern with an all-male dinner with rounds of toasting and the rest, but they also toasted the ladies. So you can find some very long articles about Chartist sociability. You find evidence of both women participating as actors and also being more or less objectified as toastees. So women in the Northern Star, I think, should be a great dissertation topic.
I mean, there is a good deal of female poetry.
Yes.
And
yes,
the letters page, you can capture some female, some women writing. And we know that when Ernest Jones becomes a more prominent Chartist in the late 1840s, some women do write to him and ask him, could he hold the meetings somewhere other than a public house? Because public houses and their upstairs meeting rooms were a kind of ideal choice for those who would host a political meeting. But clearly for women, this is becoming more and more problematic. And also many times the meetings themselves are held at times inconvenient to women with domestic responsibilities. So there are lots of reasons why women find themselves unable to do what they want to do in terms of being active members.
I think this intersected with temperance.
Yes.
No, because a lot of it had to do with finding a locale where people could participate without drinking alcohol. So when you have, men involved in temperance societies, they were excluded from pubs as well. So I think there is an intersection.
Yes, absolutely.
They determined on their position at the temperance.
Yes, precisely.
Yes.
Yeah. And there were, of course, the temperance Chartists when there's. Okay, well, thank you very much again, Joan. Very interesting.